I grew up in Arizona, a place where people often think of cacti, Mexican food, and blistering heat. Those are definitely great ways to describe Arizona, but I also remember the Wild West-esque scenes where guns were drawn in the middle of fights to establish dominance. I remember hearing distant pop pop pops in the middle of the night and drifting back to sleep. I remember countless lockdowns and canceled school days due to school shooting threats, and even a news story about a man killing people in their cars on roads I regularly drove on with his sniper. With the surge of school shootings being broadcasted on television, I became fearful for my life as well as many people in the nation. I lived parts of my childhood in areas riddled with gun violence, and although it wasn't the safest area for us kids, it gives me an inside look on the pandemic of improper firearm use in my community. I wanted to help, and banning firearms seemed like a logical step, but I knew it didn't solve any of the other deeply rooted issues in my community. We have heard all the stories before about awful school shootings. For anyone that was a student at the time or had children in school, fear and dread was in the hearts and weighed down the stomachs of everyone around. We all wanted to put an end to it. Banning guns and controlling them is still widely thought to help curb the violence we see, but throughout my experiences and research, I've concluded this is a gun problem, this isn't a gun problem, it's a cultural problem. The best way to solve a problem of this magnitude is community intervention, not taking away or restricting guns by adding fees or taxes. To address this, we have to discuss how gun violence affects us today, how we can fix the issues that create firearm abuse, and what everyone can do in our society to make a safer world. When you think about gun violence, most people would imagine school shootings, but a huge majority of gun violence is actually closer to home than you think. Most of the media's attention is focused on school shootings, and although tragic, the talk surrounding gun violence hardly focuses on the vast majority of victims. In 2015, the CDC reported that 81% of the 12,979 gun-related homicides were in urban areas, mostly populated by minorities. In fact, the firearm death for African Americans is 18.2 compared to 10.2 for white people in 2016. These numbers are largely forgotten, despite making up more than half of the victims of gun violence. The areas where the majority of these crimes take place is so important to focus on. These communities are often overlooked and frowned upon for being impoverished and crime-ridden, but the reasons why these problems exist is deeply rooted in our culture. As Robert D. Bullard, Dean of Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs and professor at Texas Southern State University, the most polluted urban communities are those with crumbling infrastructure, ongoing economic disinvestment, deteriorating housing, inadequate schools, chronic unemployment, a high poverty rate, and an overlooked healthcare system. All of the factors listed above play into creating an environment that is not satisfactory for living and create opportunities for crime to stir. When children are brought up in areas that are affected by violence, the consequences are often detrimental. A peer-reviewed study conducted in 2009 by researchers at the UCL Institute of Child Health states that there are strong ties between violence in homes, neighborhoods, and increased child mortality, drug and alcohol use, unsafe sexual practices, and criminal behavior that often leads into their adult life. High poverty and high crime are correlated because when someone is impoverished, they will commit crimes just to be able to eat or to have a house over their heads. It becomes this living for survival, not living for comfort. With all these factors going into making crime-ridden areas, it makes sense that gun violence spurs out of necessity. In order to get rid of the necessity for violence, we must fix the issues that create them. As we discussed above, the childhood of a person can shape how their future turns out. The Journal of Evidence-Informed Social Work states that one of the best ways to combat violence and crime in impoverished neighborhoods is by promoting community intervention. Prevention programs focus on teaching children better ways to manage the stresses of living a life in a community with crime. Mentorship programs, better funding for schools, and extracurriculars have been proven in preventing minors from engaging in activities. Rehabilitation focuses on changing behaviors and beliefs around gun violence. Gang diffusion intervention, centers for mental health, and conflict resolution skills fall within this category. Development is the last step in changing a crime culture in communities. Town meetings, community cleanups, and reinvestment into housing, businesses, and surrounding areas support everyone in the neighborhood with a system of growth and change. Gun violence stems from a deeper cultural problem that we can address to make society safer for all. We can add measures in schools and homes for children to remove themselves from factors that influence criminal behavior, create rehabilitation opportunities for adults that want to better their community, and development in the communities throughout encouraging economic growth and communication between the people and the local government. We've discussed the statistics on gun violence, why it has permeated our society, and the ways that we can include the community, and finally hear them out on how we can address the issues that firearm abuse stems from. Use your voice and your power as a way to lift up communities that have endured decades and centuries of oppression. Support extracurriculars, advocate for rehabilitation for gang members, and focus on putting work into fixing areas that are impoverished. Gun violence is a gaping wound in our culture, but you don't put a band-aid over those type of wounds. You figure out the source of bleeding and hurt, and you fix it. When problems like inadequate schooling, poor economic growth, and racism are addressed, and worked on, we will see a shift in our culture surrounding firearm abuse.